Hello, beautiful community. What are the non-military benefits, if any, to Ukraine of droning Russian territory? That's a question that keeps coming up. So let's try to say a little about it and frame it a bit. What I'm not going to say anything about is the point that I made recently about the needlessness of excessive moralization of Ukraine's actions, right? It's certainly not unjust for Ukraine to drone Russian territory, but it's not the point to talk about justice, right? It's neither just nor unjust. It's necessary, plus driven by values like national survival. There's a tendency for Westerners, because of our special history, to inflate the value of justice at the expense of other values, right, that also motivate human beings. There's a tendency to think that if something is the right thing to do, it must be justified in terms of the value of justice. Well, plenty of things are the right thing to do that are not justified by the value of justice. Okay, enough. Now, the benefits to Ukraine of drone attacks on Russian territory are dependent on how the war is going and on what is going on in Russian domestic politics, right? It's one answer to this question if the Kremlin is pushing hard the depoliticization direction. It's another if the Kremlin is trying to politicize Russian citizens. So the answer is always going to depend on where we're at with the war and with Russian propaganda. So let's say a little bit about this. Now, when Ukraine acts, there are several audiences, especially if the action has, an informational environment intervention sort of quality to it too. There are Ukrainians, there is very roughly the West, and then there are Russians. Now, droning Russia has a boosting psychological effect for Ukrainians. And that's a feeling of a certain kind of moralized satisfaction, a certain kind of, relief of emotional tension that goes something like this. Well, at least they're getting an infinitesimal taste of what they're doing to us, right? So that's a meaningful function of these things for the Ukrainian morale. Now, in terms of the response of Russian citizens, the Russian population, it's possible to argue that the drone attack certainly could serve some of the Kremlin's purposes and could help the Kremlin with some of its narratives. But there is one narrative that the Kremlin is pushing, among others, and it conflicts with some of its other narratives, but it's pushing one narrative that the drone attacks are actually successfully parasitic upon. And that narrative says the war is contained, it's under control, Ukraine's counteroffensive has not gone well, and the West is tiring, so let's not over worry about this. This is not getting out of control, and indeed it's turning in our favor, right? So that narrative is being effectively cracked by the drone attacks. Not comprehensively cracked, but there are some cracks introduced into that narrative by the drone attack. So it's having an effect. Now, we shouldn't overestimate this because, of course, as we know, the depoliticization dynamic, not just in Russia but globally, but in Russia too, is not about disinterest, lack of interest in politics. It's about resistance, right? It's about resisting politics, right? So we're talking about concepts like evasion, denial, not I'm not bothered, right? And that's why it is actually also possible for that resistance to grow as the thing you need to face gets more awful. Now, one final thing I'd put on the table is that there is a pattern that's likely to hold, in my opinion. This is not some kind of an expert prediction, but it's a plausible guess, and that's that the less successful Ukraine's counteroffensive, the more Ukraine will engage in attacks on Russian territory, because that will be the other lever that can be pulled, right? And if Mr. Putin is fantasizing about a long, drawn-out, semi-frozen war, right? Ukraine's answer to that, well, even if we can't break Russian defenses sufficiently, at least we're going to do this. And Putin's postcard vision of a war that lasts 3 or 4 years in a sort of a low-level state before he then escalates, Putin's postcard vision of this will be ruined, because Russian territory will be increasingly under attack by Ukraine. On the other hand, the more successful the counteroffensive, the less Ukraine may need to use this lever. Lots of love, and talk very soon.